Welcome to the Stanfords Travel Writers Festival. Appropriately enough, the world's largest map retailer brings you the history of world trade in maps now, as author and historian Philip Parker talks to Julia Wheeler.
Hello, and let me add my welcome to the Stanfords Travel Writers Festival, particularly to this session. Thanks for finding us, thanks for being here, thanks for being part of the festival. Today we are going travelling right around the world, but we are also going to be travelling in time in the company of the wonderful Philip Parker, who's here to talk about world trade in maps. Welcome, Philip. Welcome back to Stanfords.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be back this year.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you here. This book is beautiful. It's a work of scholarship. The reproductions of the maps are absolutely fantastic. There's a gem of a story, more than one gem of a story on every page. It's been a labour of love for you, hasn't it, this book?
It absolutely has. It comes as no surprise to anybody who's seen any of my books that I absolutely love and absolutely adore maps, and they're a fantastic way to look at history. And particularly in the case of world trade, it's something that sits at the background sometimes of conventional histories. And I thought that, using maps as a beautifully illustrated way to kind of get behind the history and sort of get into the history of something that people sometimes forget. I mean, trade is obviously very much at the forefront of people's minds at the moment. But, normally we forget that a lot of the kind of compelling things in world history, a lot of the themes, a lot of the strands actually had trade and people exchanging things behind them. So I thought, use maps as a way to bring that to people.
You talk about trade being a sort of catalyst to world history.
Yeah, absolutely. So, right from the very beginning, right from when people started to travel longer distances, trade and goods are something that they needed. Very early societies could produce more or less absolutely everything that they absolutely, couldn't survive without, but not things that they wanted, things that sort of make their life a little bit better, things that would improve. And so, right from the very, very start, finding somebody who had that good, that, pieces of obsidian or, today that mobile phone that you absolutely have was, absolutely key. And, searching for that, that involves both interchange with other societies, and in many cases, it actually involves violent interactions. So, you add those two together and you can see that, trade pushes people outward. It pushes people outward to make interactions. And those interactions are one of the drivers, one of the motors of history.
I think we should, as well as people wanting beautiful, useful things, perhaps we should say that trade is driven by that very human instinct for a profit.
Well, absolutely. People always want a little bit more than what they have. Right from the beginning of organized societies, people began to produce a surplus, an agricultural surplus. And the question is, what you're going to do with that? At a very basic level, you could just eat it. But, at kind of one level above, you exchange it for something else. You get a little bit more, and then you develop categories of merchants. Way back, we have the names of merchants from about 1500 BC in ancient Babylon. We actually know their names written down. It's quite extraordinary that we have the names of kind of the Bill Gates of kind of the Babylonian world. And and those people they developed sophisticated businesses 4,000 years ago, which were to make profit. I mean, this guy had a warehouse in Babylon which could actually store 18 tons of copper, which, if you consider, this is like 4,000 years ago, so kind of staggering amount. So you're absolutely right. As soon as people realized that they could actually produce a little bit more than they needed to live, they decided, let's do something with it, and hence the profit driver.
Let's talk about those people who were involved in trade, the merchants. How similar do you think the challenges and problems that they had are the same today for those people who are trading, and how much is it just completely moved on and a whole different world?
A lot of the basic problems, a lot of the basic challenges in the business of trading are probably the same now as they were 4,000 years ago in the time of this guy Nasir. And they are, one, you've got to have information. You need to know who's got what and who needs what. Where can the exchange be profitably made? You need to know that now. You need to know that 4,000 years ago. Also, you need security. So it's no good sending a ship off into pirate-infested waters, off the coast of Somalia now, and it was no good doing it then either. And also, the other thing that people need now and then is cash flow, and you need to get your finances right. So Ayan Nasser, he needed to know that he would be paid when he sent his ships down to Bahrain, so that he'd be able to pay. And so things like early means of credit notes, they appear very, very early. So all these things like information, cash flow, and security, which are kind of the ABC of trading businesses now. They were kind of maybe the alpha, beta, gamma of trading businesses, kind of the ancient Greek world.
You mentioned pirates, and we will come to pirates a little bit later. But let's have a look at one of the maps in the book. Let's have a look at Neolithic trade, because you say that this is possibly the world's oldest map.
In the book I have a map. It's a map of a volcanic eruption in the ancient Neolithic town of Çatalhöyük, which is in central Turkey now, which dates back to about 2000 BC. And there's actually, it's sort of drawn in fresco. If you look very, very carefully, you can see the cone of a volcano, this kind of triangular cone in the background, spewing out lava. And right down at the bottom, there's a map of the city, which was this sort of complex of mud brick buildings. And this was, Çatalhöyük, one of its raison d'etre was actually as a trading town. It sort of sat on an ancient obsidian route. Obsidian is a very, very sharp volcanic glass. And here we have in the background a volcano. So the solidified lava, which turns this kind of very, very black color, can be kind of basically hacked off and makes this very, very sharp blade. So in the era before people actually had discovered metallurgy and iron blades, they used this obsidian to make blades. So this Çatalhöyük, it sits on this trade route, kind of trading this obsidian kind of into the Aegean as far east as the Iranian plateau. So this very first map ever almost actually sits on one of the it sort of displays one of the most ancient trade routes as well. So there's kind of fascinating kind of intersection of kind of trade and people's growing vision of the world, and those two always sit together. Kind of people's kind of knowledge of the world grows as trade grows.
Obsidian was obviously really useful, and at that time you talk about animals also being traded, but there were also what we call now luxury goods. I mean, shells, for example, which were used in jewelry. So what's the balance really in terms of the necessities of life with the luxuries of life at this time?
There's always from very early times, the majority of stuff in terms of just sheer bulk is always going to be necessities, because grain, kind of animal carcasses, even to an extent animal hide, they're quite bulky, and those kind of would take up the majority of a kind of a merchant's consignment. But always kind of the icing on the top, which it doesn't weigh much, these fabulously expensive shells, spondylus shells, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, even gold, compared to kind of your grain, it's not that heavy. So you could perhaps make the majority of your profit actually with these luxury goods. It might be a little bit more difficult to find somebody who's going to buy them, but if you can, that's going to actually secure that just extra bit of profit. So right from the very beginning, these luxury goods, they flow. From the lapis lazuli mountain in Badakhshan in Afghanistan, lapis appears in ancient Egypt and in ancient Greece. It's a kind of, considering these are traveling 4,000 years ago, it's a fantastic distance. But it shows right back then, people had an eye for luxury. They weren't getting on the internet and finding kind of, the latest fantastically expensive kind of jogging watch for £3,000 or buying a £10,000 mattress. But, they were thinking, lapis lazuli, it's just, it's very, very hard to get. So a merchant comes with a consignment of that. If you've got the money, you're gonna sit up and pay attention.
Fantastic. Why wouldn't you? Beautiful. So let's move on now to the earliest world map, which is actually a clay tablet.
Yep. So this is it's known as the Babylonian map of the world. It's not quite a map of the world as we know it. Is a map of the world as the Babylonians saw it, and as all good imperial people, which they were, where is Babylon? It kind of sits right in the middle of this clay tablet. It's kind of Babylon's this kind of circle with a star in, and there are Babylon satellite towns all displayed around it. Kind of right on the edge are kind of what we might say is a kind of map of here be dragons, more or less, because it's kind of like unknown parts of the world which literally have a kind of sea monsters and bits of the world which they say are completely in darkness. But this was, Babylon was the biggest town in the world at the time. It was, it was the premier. It sat at the center of kind of the world as far as the kind of Middle East and kind of Western Asia was concerned. It got a lot of its money from trade from its empire. And on this, fantastically precious clay tablet, which has survived for 2,600 years, we see something which actually is kind of important for world trade, and actually kind of important for traders now, that whoever was the kind of hegemonic trade power at the time considered themselves to be at the center of the world, much as kind of the British considered themselves, and perhaps we still do to an extent, as the center of the world. The Greenwich Meridian, goes right through Britain. That's the kind of, geographical kind of indication that we thought we were at the center of the world, and all of those trading powers did. Naturally, it's sometimes a mistake to assume this because it's a viewpoint that other people hold from their point of view in a different fashion. So, when you get clashes of these worldviews, then something has to give, somebody has to concede, and that's going to create tension.
Yeah, a lesson for today, that's for sure. Let's stay in the Middle Eastern region and talk about Petra and the frankincense route for all fans of Indiana Jones and those beyond.
Absolutely. So, Petra, as kind of many of us know, is one of the most fabulous, really kind of romantic, ancient kind of sites. Absolutely, the Nabateans who lived there cut these tombs from the living rock and made these absolutely extravagant facades. I mean, they're absolutely gorgeous. And, it's accessed by going through this narrow crevice in the rock called the Seep, which is this canyon through which kind of Indiana Jones rides, and through which I actually had the opportunity to ride on a horse, feeling Indiana Jones myself. But this was this was paid for by trade. It was paid for by something that seems a little bit mundane. But the Nabateans, who built Petra, they controlled the spice trade in frankincense and myrrh, which went up the west coast of the Arabian Peninsula. And they weren't actually the traders necessarily themselves. They got one step smarter than just being merchants. They extracted tolls. Now, there's a lot of talk about tariffs and all of this at the moment. But basically, in the ancient world, they really were a way of making money. If you sat on the trade routes, nobody could get past you if you were powerful enough without paying a toll, a tariff. And the only way up out of the Arabian Peninsula that was viable was via Petra. So they extracted tolls from everybody and became just fantastically rich. I mean, just enormously rich. So rich that this city basically sat in a desert, was able to build these absolutely extraordinary monuments on the basis of, £50 a ton or more or less, on the frankincense and myrrh. And they controlled this trade for several centuries. Lots of people tried to attack it to get a piece of the trade. The Greeks tried to attack it, it failed. The Assyrians tried to attack it, they failed. It was only finally when the Romans attacked it in the age of Trajan, they sort of found a way around the back and they captured it. And then, naturally, as the Romans were now in control of the trade route, they got all the money, they got all the tariffs, and Petra declined, unfortunately for us in a sense, because it was sort of never demolished and redeveloped. We have these fantastic monuments today, but it was, Petra is a monument to what trade can get you.
Those beautiful buildings, the treasury, and all of it, that's absolutely wonderful place. What is it they say? There's a poem, I think, a rose-coloured city half as old as time.
It's not quite rose red, but poetic license is permitted. And the Casne, which is this absolutely extraordinary facade, is the first thing you see on entering the city. The kind of the local Bedouin tribes thought that it might be, the treasury of the pharaohs. Lots of the monuments in Arabic have names associated with the pharaohs because they thought, something like this must have been built by the same guys who built the pyramids. Stands to reason. It's not that far away. If you look very carefully on pictures, or if you ever get the chance, whatever gets the chance to travel and go there again, there are actually kind of pockmarks on what looks like a huge, great trophy on the top of the treasury. And that's because local Bedouins in, I think, the 18th or early 19th century took pot shots at it on the basis that this enormous, great, what looks like a trophy, must contain gold coins. And if they shot it and cracked it, these gold coins would come tumbling out. Fortunately, they didn't succeed in breaking it. Unfortunately for them, of course, it's actually empty.
I'm imagining you now there, galloping down the street with your Indiana Jones hat on, but we should talk about the person who, in inverted commas, rediscovered Petra, which is a chap called Buckheart, who it was the early 19th century. I mean, that's a classic case of Europeans thinking, isn't it? Oh, look what we've discovered, when actually it's been there for centuries. And I think that pattern is something that comes through in many of the stories within the book and on the maps.
Yeah, I mean, Jacob Burckhardt, he encountered it, I think is probably the best phrase to use. In 1812, he had to disguise himself as a kind of Muslim holy man in order to be allowed to go near there. There's a site there called Jebel Haroun, which is the mountain of Aaron, on which Moses' brother is supposed to have kind of stood and gazed down at the valley below. So he claimed to be going on a pilgrimage to this, and he claimed that he had to stop very, very often to pray. And what he was actually doing was taking notes at the time. So he used prayer time as an opportunity to do that. But of course, his guide knew it was there. All the local people had known it was there. They didn't know quite what its significance was, but they'd known it. They'd never forgotten that it was there. And a lot of the story of trade as it can be told traditionally is of Europeans discovering new lands. And of course, excepting in the case of uninhabited areas, they didn't discover them at all. There were local people who lived there. Columbus, when he came across the New World in 1492, the kind of, it didn't take long for them to land on an island on which there were kind of native peoples living there who, of course, if they had it explained to them that their land had just been discovered, they would have found it extremely surprising. Vasco da Gama, who kind of rounded the coast of southern Africa and ended up in India in 1497-98. Of course, he didn't discover India at all. I mean, there had been people living there since very, very ancient times and extraordinarily sophisticated civilizations. The Aztecs and the Incas were not discovered by the Spanish. They'd been there all along. So, it's possible to get, a very kind of jaundiced Eurocentric view of trade in one sense, but actually looking at world trade properly can very much counter this. There's a Chinese explorer called Zheng He, who was a kind of admiral who was sent by the Ming Emperor at the beginning of the 15th century in 1405. Not exactly to explore. His mission he went with a fleet of extraordinarily large, they're called treasure ships, 300 feet long. They were kind of the aircraft carriers of the Middle Ages. I mean, absolutely enormous, extravagant, very showy things. And they were supposed to impress, as I'm sure they did, but crucially to get peoples that he encountered to acknowledge the Chinese emperor as the ruler, and and to give him tribute. And he would when he arrived there, people would try to pay him off, give him gifts, give him tribute. And that would be taken by Zheng He and the Ming Emperor back home as an acknowledgement that this area acknowledged Chinese suzerainty. But one of the very interesting things about Zheng He is he arrived off the west coast of Africa in the 1410s, sorry, the east coast of Africa in the 1410s. And he sailed down as far as Tanzania. So it was, if he'd gone a little bit further, it would have been the Chinese who were the first ones to kind of round the Cape of Good Hope. kind of 75 or 80 years, before the Portuguese did. So, looking at world trade history as a European thing is kind of, it's only looking at most one side of the picture.
And he brought back to China, didn't he, some interesting animals. They were particularly excited by the giraffes, I think.
Yes, they were. So, I mean, you can imagine, a giraffe on the face of it is actually quite an odd and extraordinary looking creature. Kind of what on earth was nature doing with this enormously long neck? So one of the sultans on the East African coast, I think it was the Sultan of Kilwa, gifted several giraffes to the Chinese, who were, delighted at this piece of kind of natural history tribute, and it was taken back home. And extraordinarily, the giraffe actually survived the voyage from East Africa all the way through the Indian Ocean, right back to China. And when it got back home, it resembled a creature of Chinese mythology called the qilin, which I think, the resemblance was largely the very long neck. But this caused enormous excitement because the qilin only appeared once in an epoch, and it presaged extraordinary good fortune for China and for the emperor. So the arrival of the giraffe was actually, as far as the Chinese court were concerned, far more exciting and far more auspicious than any of the other treasure and kind of scrolls containing proclamations of tribute that he might have got, which in one sense is quite sort of frustrating, I imagine, for kind of Zheng He, who'd gone to a great deal of effort to collect all of this treasure, and then it's the Richard giraffe which is the most important thing. But he was allowed to go back on several further voyages, so he remained in court favor as a consequence.
So he was, but then the Ming dynasty sort of changed its policy again and went back to that quite closed idea where they weren't outward looking, were they? And so he got kind of, his discoveries sort of got forgotten.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of faded away. I mean, one of the interesting characteristics of Chinese history in the pre-modern period is that China is a very pretty self-contained world, a very successful economy and kind of political system that produced more or less everything that it needed. So whereas for Europe, the difference is kind of for Europe, trade wasn't really an optional extra. Europe was in many ways an economically unsuccessful kind of appendage of Eurasia. So, to leverage itself economically, Europe really needed trade. Whereas China didn't really need trade. It was kind of that extra, trade continued overland across the Silk Route for those kind of luxury goods. But what they could get by sea was a bit of an optional extra. Sea also brought in uncontrolled foreign influences, which the Chinese court didn't like. So gradually it was forbidden to go on oceanic voyages. It was forbidden to build big ships. The plans were destroyed, and Zheng He was gradually forgotten. It's a phenomenon that occurred in Japan too. That sort of, the Japanese began to trade, began to accept outside traders, the Portuguese, the Spanish, and then the Dutch in the 16th or 17th century. But then they saw actually it brought more than guns and muskets, which is what they really wanted, and kind of luxury goods. It brought foreign influences which were harder to control. And so in the middle of the 17th century, the Japanese basically closed themselves up. They, something like North Korea today, they tried to hermetically seal themselves, and to a great extent were successful. So foreign traders were confined to one small island off Nagasaki, where a couple of dozen Dutch traders were allowed to trade in the few goods which the Japanese court felt that they wanted. And that was the case for 200 years until the Americans turned up and at the point of a gunship violently said, look, you have to open up, and the Japanese did. But sometimes trade opens up, but sometimes countries try to close themselves up again, and it's often to do with trying to keep out foreign influences, because one of the reasons that a study of world trade is quite fascinating is it's not only the goods, it's not only the lapis lazuli and the washing machines that travel, but it's people and its ideas. It can be languages, it can be religion. A religion like Buddhism traveled up through trade routes from India into China. And, obviously, Christianity kind of traveled outside Europe through the trade routes which were established first by traders and then by imperialists.
Again, a resonance for today in terms of other things that travel, and whether people see those as good, bad, or indifferent. Let's come back to this idea of that was kind of handed down to us, of Europeans being the ones to go out there and discover. And this map of circumnavigation, which comes from the middle of the 16th century. Magellan or Magellan?
This is what you see. My Portuguese isn't my best language, but I go for Magellan more or less, because that's when I first heard about it when I was 10. I think that was the pronunciation, and it's just stuck. But yeah, so for now, Magellan. So he was a Portuguese. He was a kind of navigator in kind of Portuguese service, and when Columbus discovered. Encountered the New World, I should definitely say. There was a bit of a kind of contretemps with the Portuguese, because they were the two great European trading nations at the time, and the two great maritime nations. Now, the Portuguese might well have found the Americas before about the same time, or a little bit after Columbus. But what's for sure is that they were pretty cross. That the Spanish were laying claim to the New World, and it was going to cause one of those, a trade war, effectively, we might say, but a trade war involving guns, and so a treaty was brokered in 1494 via the good officers of the papacy, called the Treaty of Tordesillas, which basically drew a line down the map. West of this is where the Spanish rule, Peru and Mexico. And east of it is where the Portuguese should rule. Now, the Portuguese, not entirely by coincidence, managed to draw their line so that Brazil was actually east of their line. They weren't supposed to know about Brazil until 1500, but hey presto, not that long after the treaty, they discovered or encountered Brazil. The important thing about this line was that it was supposed to exclude the Spice Islands, which are way on the other side of the world, in modern Indonesia, where things like nutmegs and cloves and pepper, which were at the time fabulously expensive, were produced. And that was kind of a Portuguese monopoly. They'd broken into that part of the Indian Ocean first and established a trade there. So the Tordesillas line was supposed to exclude them. Now, there's a little bit of a flaw in this, which is that obviously, as everybody knew by now, the world was round. So it wasn't any good just drawing a line, because actually you would have to extend the line beyond the poles. They didn't quite understand that they were there, but they knew the world was a globe, and the line would, of course, go around the other side. Now, nobody had thought about this. So before too long, an enormous argument blows up about where does the line go on the other side. And basically, Magellan was sent out to find this line. Now, the idea was that he would find that the hope was that his Spanish sponsors hoped that he would find that the Spice Islands were actually on the Spanish side of the line, and that therefore, they could say, "Hang on, this very expensive spice trade, it belongs to us." In fact, his voyage met with so many mishaps, and the sort of cartographic kind of expertise at the time wasn't sufficient to actually draw a definitive line. So his voyage didn't achieve that. What it did achieve was, I think one can actually say, this is a first for Europeans. His voyage was the first to go right the way around the world. Unfortunately, he wasn't the first to go right the way around the world. Because in the Philippines, he and his crew became embroiled in an argument involving a local ruler, and in the fight which erupted, Magellan was killed. So his crew carried on. They had to burn one ship because it became rotten. One ship they didn't have enough to crew. So by the time they actually got home, 3.5 just over 3 years after they'd set out, 3 years and a month. Of the several hundred sailors and 5 ships which had set out, only one ship and 18 men made it. There are another couple of dozen who'd been arrested on their way by another European country, and they kind of crawled in later. But basically, it was a crew of 18 which made it on this voyage around the world, which doesn't seem like, to us, kind of an enormous success ratio. But it was met kind of astonishment and kind of jubilation. And Sebastian Elcano, who was the man who should be remembered as the captain who crewed the first voyage around the world rather than Magellan, he was allowed, he was given a new coat of arms which had kind of sticks of clove and nutmegs on it as a kind of celebration of his achievement, which is it makes a change from kind of dragons and unicorns and lions, couchant. So he kind of had cinnamon rampant and sort of cloves couchant on his coat of arms, and his family forever, had this to remember this kind of extraordinary achievement. And they came back with a couple of tons of spices, which it wasn't that much, but they still made a fantastic voyage. And it was established that this was possible. You could go this way, you could go all the way around the world, and crucially, that you could go from South America across the Pacific to the Philippines and the Spice Islands of Indonesia. So in a way, this kind of, it knit the world together. It kind of, it proved that, the world was a whole. You could travel all the way around it. And so, this opened up new ideas of trade routes which were possible. And, ironically, Magellan, or kind of Elcano to be precise, he achieved what Columbus thought he had achieved or thought he was going to achieve, because the whole purpose of Columbus's voyage was not really a voyage of exploration. I mean, that's what we remember him as, a great explorer. But, what one might imagine him as was a failed trade expedition, because he was supposed to be finding a quick way from Europe to East Asia to get into the spice trade, which was being blocked by kind of Muslim powers, which had kind of, the Ottoman Empire, which had expanded, had blocked some kind of traditional land routes which Europeans had used to trade. So Columbus's Columbus's mission number one was to find a sea route to kind of circumvent that. And he was, obviously fantastically excited when he encountered the coast of kind of what we now know as the Americas. That's why the kind of, the indigenous peoples of the Americas got kind of called Indians, because, they thought, well, maybe if it's not China, which they call Cathay, maybe it's India. That's almost as good because they got pepper. So they call them Indians. But it wasn't that at all. Columbus's voyage from that point of view, was a failure, a trading failure. And kind of, Magellan's and Elcano's, that was the thing which said, okay, we know the way. We know the way round through the back door where we can get access to this fantastically expensive trade.
Wonderful, wonderful stories. I said we'd talk about pirates. Now is the moment. Pirates and privateers. And this map is a different style again, isn't it? And in that it really tells a story, and it's telling the story of Francis Drake.
Yeah, and this is a maps can be used in an extraordinarily wide range of fashions. Just to show you where you are, to show you where you might want to go, to say, we own this or we've been here. But they can also be used to tell a story, an actual narrative. And this map shows Drake's ships kind of steaming, well, not steam, they're kind of sailing into Cartagena Harbor, kind of in the Caribbean. And kind of as we can see from the story about the kind of the Spanish and the Portuguese struggling for control of the Americas, much of the Americas, apart from Brazil, was basically a Spanish monopoly. To trade there, you needed a license from something called the Casa de Contratación in Seville, and to get a license, you basically had to be Spanish. And essentially, if you tried to trade in the Spanish-controlled Americas, which is basically more or less kind of everything kind of south of California, you were regarded as a pirate, and if you were caught, you were subject to the death sentence. This didn't stop kind of English and French privateers from going there and kind of, well, they weren't exactly trading in the sense that we might know. It was kind of, it really was kind of pirate capitalism in its truest sense, that what they were after was predating on kind of money that the Spanish had already made. So they would attack Spanish treasure fleets. They would attack Spanish towns. They would loot them, take any precious goods which were there. So basically, Drake in the 1580s, he'd already been on 2 voyages, which had been pretty successful in this regard. So he got permission from Queen Elizabeth to kind of embark on an even bigger one. And his target was Spanish-controlled cities. He wasn't having too much luck, to be honest, until he came across Cartagena, which was not that well defended. It relied upon its wall for its defense. Kind of looking at the map, you can actually see kind of, some kind of English kind of soldiers kind of landing and disembarking. And basically, Drake, who was, as well as extremely violent, was pretty cunning, worked out, or somebody told him, that this pretty impressive wall, which went down to the beach, did not go down to the beach at low tide. So when the tide came out, it left this gap between the wall and the sea, through which, having disembarked his crew, and presumably, the Spanish settlers on the other side were kind of making rude faces, saying, we've got a big wall, you're not getting through. When the tide went out, he and his crew snuck round, and the defense collapsed. And so Drake then demanded an enormous, great kind of ransom from the people of Cartagena. It wasn't his business to capture Cartagena or to settle. He didn't remotely have the men. He didn't have the intention. The kind of city authorities of Cartagena still reckoned that they could mount a defense, and they refused to hand over money. So basically, kind of what did Drake do? He and his crew basically started burning the poshest houses in Cartagena one by one. Said, kind of, now you're going to hand over your money. And so after a bit of this, and the ransom having increased, they handed over the treasure chests, and Drake sailed away. Sailed back home to kind of initial enormous acclaim from Queen Elizabeth, who as well as wanting kind of the glory of having kind of singed the King of Spain's beard, was also after money, because the war with Spain, which was being conducted, was pretty expensive. She had to support her Dutch allies who were in rebellion against the Spanish. So kind of the fact that Drake brought back hard cash was, to Queen Elizabeth, actually kind of a far more impressive achievement than if he said, okay, we now own Cartagena, because it would be a bit like having the kind of the old Kent Road of the kind of the New World in the 16th century. It'd be like, what we're going to do with this? We'd have to defend it. Too expensive. But actually, this kind of this piracy, this privateering, as well as embarrassing the Spanish, which was, of course, the Queen was delighted about, actually yielded money. So for a long time down there, for about a century, kind of British trading, in inverted commas, with the New World was basically piracy.
But then when the boot then was on the other foot later, wasn't it? When some of those buccaneers who sort of stayed down there and were not backed by the British state or the English state, we did clamp down on them. People like Blackbeard and so on.
Yeah, sort of, Blackbeard and kind of Henry Morgan, all these kind of, I imagine them tremendous kind of 1950s epics with Errol Flynn, but they were real people. The legends about them, there's a famous one that kind of, Blackbeard would go into battle with kind of, gunpowder sizzling kind of, on fuses from his hat. And now, it's terribly kind of Pirates of the Caribbean. Why that's meant to impress anybody? Because all the other side has to do is kind of wait until your hat explodes, and that's the end of you. But it was these things were sort of they were intended to kind of terrify the opposition. Now, kind of the Caribbean was a kind of a bit of a liminal space. It had begun to be kind of, the British and the French had begun to kind of, get in there. The British kind of took over Jamaica in 1655, but a lot of the islands, a lot of the ports, they were absolute free-for-alls. There was no real law. But there was a lot of money to be made, not only Francis Drake, but, extremely unofficial expeditions, i.e. pirates, could make enough money. People who'd escaped from the law, or who were the kind of as it were the kind of the devilish equivalent of the Pilgrim Fathers. They'd gone there in search not of kind of enlightenment, but in search of trouble. That they could make a very good living in a short window. It was about a century or so before the state actually kind of appeared in force, before the British Navy became powerful enough. In the heyday of the age of piracy, the British were patrolling the entire Caribbean with a dozen ships. Now, we may probably only have a dozen ships in the Caribbean now, but they're much kind of more sophisticated operations. It required hundreds of ships actually to clamp down on piracy, and eventually, when Britain really became a kind of a true imperial power, and with a navy which actually was big enough to kind of project British power, then the age of the pirates ended. Kind of one by one, they went out with a blaze of glory. The kind of the last major pirate, he died off the west coast of Africa. He thought he could outrun the British Navy, but in one huge broadside, they just basically they blew his ship away. And that was that. So although clearly piracy it's a problem right up until the present day in various kind of waterways of the world. In the Caribbean, that kind of not very romantic if you were at the receiving end of it, but that kind of romantic age of piracy, it came to an end. There wasn't that space between overlapping jurisdictions anymore. The French, the Dutch, the British, the Spanish, the Portuguese, kind of by about the 17th, they got it all sewn up. And once they got it all sewn up, of course, they started to fight with each other. But that's a different story.
So let's leave those warm waters of the Caribbean behind and come up to the Baltic, and talk about Sweden, Russia, and that whole sort of northern European area, because Russia was so keen to have access to the Baltic, but those other surrounding countries didn't want to let them have that for the fur trade, did they?
Absolutely. So in the book, the map is by a Swedish cartographer called Olaus Magnus, who was actually a priest who fled Sweden when the Reformation came, and it's an absolute riot. I mean, as well as all the other things we've discussed, the purposes of the maps, some of them they're just for the visual pleasure of it. And there are people kind of on skis and sledges and reindeer all around the Baltic. It's a beautifully fantastically visually appealing map. But what it also shows is that the Baltic has a kind of narrow choke point kind of through Denmark. It's rimmed by kind of competing powers: Sweden, Norway, kind of the Baltic powers, Russia, Poland, and Germany. And control of trade in the Baltic was fantastically lucrative. Now, Russia doesn't have kind of warm water access to it, kind of anywhere, unless it goes through the Baltic and has control of it. So, the Baltic became the subject of kind of, a series of kind of great power wars in the kind of 16th and 17th and 18th century. As first kind of, Sweden had kind of the biggest part of the action, but then under Peter the Great, kind of at the beginning of the 18th century, the Russians broke out, began to control what's kind of now Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And, a lot of that was the fur trade, further east, kind of the north of Russia, it's very cold, has fur-bearing animals, which, fur was kind of, it's kind of like the sort of pepper and spices of the north. I wouldn't recommend kind of wearing pepper itself, as kind of, but the fur, they kept you warm. Mink and sable, they were in enormous demand, kind of in Europe, kind of and kind of Northern Europe particularly. And so anybody who controlled those routes, anybody who get their ships out, was going to make a fantastic profit. So one thing you can say about wherever there's a strategic trade route, there is about to be, or you have to guard against there being a war or political conflict. So we see that today, kind of the oil route through the Strait of Hormuz, kind of kind of Iran, kind of Iraq, Saudi Arabia, kind of enormous geopolitical flashpoint. It's a narrow point. Kind of the narrows between kind of Indonesia and kind of Southeast Asia. It's enormous potential flashpoint. Kind of the kind of South China Sea, kind of big trade route, kind of enormous geopolitical flashpoint between kind of Japan, the Koreas, China, and similarly kind of South America, the Panama Canal, which sort of cut kind of the beginning of the 20th century to vastly shorten the kind of distance that you had to travel to get from the Atlantic and the Pacific. So that again, an enormous kind of geopolitical flashpoint. There hasn't been a kind of recent war over it, but it just shows you the kind of wherever there's a narrowing and wherever there's a kind of glut of trade going through it, kind of the politics really begins to come into it.
I found that one of the really interesting things about this map is it's so colourful and jolly, but when we think of that area, certainly from this part of the world, we think, God, that looks really chilly. It's not the colours that I would naturally associate, but that's part of the story that people tell themselves, isn't it? About others, but also about themselves. The cartography for that map sees that region in a very positive, warm light.
Yeah, and the maps that people produce and the ways in which they portray the world, and in this case the way in which they kind of trade, it tells you a lot about them. In fact, the Olaus Magnus map of the Baltic, it's got lots of kind of jolly reds and sort of greens. So although they're not the most warm colours, they're warming colours. They're kind of cheerful colours. They may be sort of compensation, but they kind of make you feel kind of a bit happier. There's another kind of map in the book. It's a kind of Aztec map of their capital, Tenochtitlan, which is modern Mexico City. And it has an eagle with a serpent in his mouth sitting on top of a cactus with kind of four kind of blue bands in a cross coming out. And that's the map which tells the story of how the city was founded. Their god told them, found a city where you find this extraordinary thing, an eagle sitting on top of a cactus eating a serpent. They found it. They built their city. The blue stripes are the canals, which kind of the causeways and canals which connected Tenochtitlan, which was on a lake, to the rest of Mexico. So the map shows you a lot about their view of the world, and they in turn were an amazing trading people. They had a special kind of social group called the Pochteca, who were themselves merchants. They were trading throughout their empire. So the map shows you a bit of that. But it also shows you a kind of a story and a very different narrative about their place in the world. It's a very different narrative from the ones that the Spanish told about the Aztecs, about how they came and conquered. People tell stories about themselves through maps, and that's why they're one of the kind of most fascinating ways into history.
They absolutely are. Thank you so much for sharing your stories with us today. We have just scratched the surface. We haven't got onto coffee, tea, sugar, the slave trade, internet, tourism, banking, all sorts of things that are in that book, and have got similarly glorious stories to go with them. Philip, thanks so much for being here with us today and for sharing those. Thank you to everybody for watching. Of course, the book is available on the Stanfords website. I would really recommend that you go and take a metaphorical flick through there. And thank you for giving us a verbal flick through of this wonderful book here today, Philip.
Thank you. It's been my absolute pleasure to share just a few of the stories in the book with you.
Thank you both. Well, rest assured you can scratch that surface by getting your copy of The History of World Trade in Maps by Philip Parker at stanfords.co.uk, and then enjoy it with coffee, tea and sugar. And if it's specialist maps you want, Stanfords is proud to offer its print-on-demand service. We'll print any map you need, centred on a postcode, a landmark or a continent at a scale to suit. Just email sales@stanfords.co.uk.